screwed up. I should have ripped your friggin' head off to make sure you wasn't dead. I intend to correct my oversight. Thanks for the invite. Shall we? A podcast?
Oh boy, welcome to another episode of Spawnography. I'm your host, Pierce.
I'm George.
With me as always.
I'm George. Oh my gosh.
Oh boy. So that's a quote from Overtkill.
Overtkill. Who is Italian. Canonically Italian, I think.
We're going to get into it, but I don't know that he sounds like... You know what? Honestly, that was a
it's
better
a me,
Mario voice than Chris
Overtkill.
Pratt.
Yeah, I could do Chris Pratt's job, pretty much. All except for the white supremacist stuff.
Wow. Oh yeah, I forgot about that. Anyway, welcome back to Spawnography, a podcast where George and I read all of Spawn and we talk about it for better or for worse. Mostly for better. We're having a great time so far.
Today we're reveling in the power of the Todd father.
And honestly, and we're still in an era of his powers being pretty strong. This is issues 6 and 7 of Spawn. So I guess the end of 1993, correct? Or is it? Yeah, it's the end of 1993, I believe.
Yeah, I think you're right.
This is a little 2-issue arc. Before we get a bunch of guest writers, we covered one of those issues, the Alan Moore issue, number 8, the last episode. This is leading into what Terry Fitzgerald calls the Critics' Choice Special Writers Series. I guess that's how they were referring to it in the Spawn office. Also known as...
That's such an MLM way to refer to it, too.
Yeah, also known as the Cocoa Swiss is what they also call it. So, wow. You know what? Take what you will from that.
That's incredible.
But basically, all that means is that he's going to, in the next issue, tell us what's going to happen vaguely in all of the guest writer issues. So that's kind of cool. So if you were reading Spawn number 6, you would get to know what was coming out. There must have been a delay, by the way, because cover dates are November for Spawn number 6 and January for Spawn number 7.
Well, you know, Todd took Christmas off, I'm sure, to be with Wanda and Cyan. So there's a reason we covered 5 and 8 in the previous issue and skipped over these two, which is number 5 and number 8, which, as you know, if you listened to last episode, connect to each other as the story of Billy Kincaid, you know, before and after his death. Pierce can fill us in on kind of what you need to know about the last installment of Spawn.
Yeah, so previously on Spawn, we won't go all the way from the top, but there's a guy named Al. He's come back from the dead. He doesn't really know why. Over the course of the first arc, he finds out that he made a deal. He knows that he made a deal to see his wife again. He doesn't know why he was killed. He doesn't really know how he was killed. He keeps getting these visions. His body is badly burned. It's in bad shape. He doesn't look like himself anymore, but he realizes he has powers. He's got cool chains and a cool cape and some sort of... He's not immortal, but he has these powers that, you know, he can shapeshift. We're going to find out he can teleport.
But do all kinds of weird stuff.
Yeah, using these powers always kind of makes him pass out. At the end of the first arc, he meets the Malbolgia who turned him into Spawn. And it kind of explains that the whole deal is that he will send bad people to hell. So Malbolgia can mount an army of Hellspawn against the forces of heaven. And then in issue 5, we meet Billy Kincaid. He is a child murderer, and he's kind of Spawn's first victim. First time that we get to see Spawn fulfilling the mission that he's been given. And then in issue 8, we see what happens to Billy when he gets to hell. And we find out exactly what becoming part of Malbolgia's army means. This is a little two-parter that comes kind of in between. It's Todd's last arc before he hands over writing duties for about 4 issues, issues 8 9, 10, and 11. And those will be written by Alan Moore, as I mentioned, for 8, then Neil Gaiman for 9, Dave Sim for 10, and Frank Miller for 11. We're not totally sure how we're covering those yet. It looks like it might be one per, because one issue per episode for the next few episodes, just because there's kind of a lot to unpack with those.
The Todd McFarlane Golden Crown Ultimate Barbecue Uptown series, or whatever he called it.
I believe it's Coco Swiss, the Critics' Choice Special Writers Series.
That's right.
So,
That's right.
Yeah,
Coco
show some
Swiss.
respect.
I'm so sorry. Coco Swiss definitely sounds like an 80s wrestler from like the WWF.
But probably like more local.
Yeah.
Like Coco Swiss fought against the Iron Claw. Anyway, we're going to get into this two-parter in issues 6 and 7. It's a two-parter called Payback. And a quick overview is that with Spawn kind of being around, the mafia in New York has become aware, and they realize that they need something stronger to deal with him.
Yeah, they think he's responsible for all the murders that Violator committed in the first arc, where
Right.
Spawn's fellow demon, or a demon from the same level of hell as the Malbolgia Violator, killed a bunch of mob bosses by ripping out their hearts, and now the mafia thinks that Spawn is responsible. So they're
Right.
bringing in some outside help from a Sicily.
And it's a cyborg named Overtkill who shows up, fights Spawn, thinks he kills Spawn, tells lead mafia boss Tony Twist that he can't go back to Italy right away because he's not 100%. His arm gets ripped off in the fight, so he sticks around. Spawn, meanwhile, realizes, like, boy, I just got lucky that I made it out of that first fight, but I can't use my powers too much because, as Malbolgia had explained, if he uses up all of his powers, he will die. He will go through a second death, and Malbolgia doesn't really care if that happens. So
Yeah,
he's
he'll
not going to
return
replenish his
and
powers.
be part of Malbolgia's demon Hellspawn
Right.
army.
So he remembers that when he was a world famous government assassin, he had fought cyborgs before, and he notices and he remembers that he doesn't really need his powers to do so, and he knows exactly where to get the weapons that he needs. And so we get sort of, commando Spawn with a ton of guns, as is the 90s way. And then he fights Overtkill in issue 7, and I mean that's pretty much it. The issue 7, there's not a ton.
It's a massive fight between Spawn and Overtkill. So yeah, it's pretty much just this buildup of the mafia in the U.S. calling in their big Italian stallion Overtkill to take down Spawn, who they think has murdered all their bosses, and then what happens when they finally clash.
Yeah. Issue 6, Payback Part 1. That's Story Pencils and Inks by Todd McFarlane. Letters and editor, Tom Orzechowski. Story consultant, Terry Fitzgerald. Colors by Steve Oliff, Ruben Rude, and Oleoptics. And this one, dedicated to Stan Lee, which is fitting considering the origin of Overtkill.
Yeah, it
Co-created by Rob Liefeld.
It's true. That's right. Co-created by Rob Liefeld on Stan Lee. What is it?
Is it Comic Book Greats?
Book Greats. Stan Lee Comic Book Greats. Yeah.
So Comic Book Greats was a videotape you could send away for. I don't think it ever aired on TV, but it was a videotape that you could send away for, which has been advertised in previous issues of Spawn, where it was Stan Lee talking to the greatest artists of the era. So there's one for Jim Lee, John Romita Jr., Todd and Rob get ones, where really Stan just kind of interviews them, talks about their process. They end up drawing characters while he's talking to them. One of the things he does with Rob and Todd, though, is he asks them to create a new character, and he's going to give them a name, and then they have to design the character. And so this character, now he's called Overkill. Like Stan says Overkill.
And even in the comic, the first time they name him, he's called Overkill. They say in whispered voices, some call him Overkill.
Yeah, which is weird because right next to it, it says Overtkill.
Yeah. Overtkill cannot be damaged. So he's Overtkill, which you have to assume was something to do with probably Stan Lee calling him Overkill or something and not wanting to pay Stan Lee any money because God knows that Stan Lee and everyone else at that time, especially in that era, creators' rights were a huge and are still a huge issue. That was basically when the first wave of those problems and the publicity about those problems was cresting. So certainly, I think in the scene where Rob, I've referenced this before, Rob Liefeld, Stanley says like, "Well, what are we gonna call him?" And Rob Liefeld's like, "Well, you're gonna call my lawyer about that. Like, you're gonna call my agent, and we're gonna figure that out." Basically saying like, "You're not gonna take possession of any of the things I have just created, Stanley."
Right.
Which is also part of the situation that led to the founding of Image Comics in the first place, with the exodus of creators from Marvel, primarily artists, Todd McFarlane chief among them, to create a company where they would own everything. So it all kind of ties back historically to, Stan Lee and Marvel Comics. And so it is interesting that it's dedicated to Stan Lee.
Yeah, I think the thing that's very interesting is that despite the fact that they changed a few things, this still ended up being a big pain in the ass for Todd and Spawn, because
That won't be the only
there's
thing in this issue that winds up
well,
being a big pain in the ass for Todd. We'll get to that.
but Overkill was already a character in Guardians of the Galaxy.
Mm.
Like so there was just some weird like Marvel lawyers being like, "Hey, you can't do that."
Basically, like, you quit, so we're gonna tag you for anything we can.
The funny thing is that the character they come up with does look pretty much exactly like this. I mean, this is kind of streamlined a little bit.
Yeah, you can tell it's draft 2.
It's also Todd interpreting Rob's character design. And I will say this about Rob Liefeld. I've been a Rob Liefeld art defender in the past. The guy can at least create, like, design characters
He has some kind of an
pretty
imagination
effectively.
on him, that's for sure. You know, I don't even want to get the fuck into it, but this is a very Rob Liefeld set of issues in a way, with the giant guns and all that kind of stuff, and like we said, the commando spawn element. And we'll get to that because starting off this issue, we open in a Sicily, like I said, with Overtkill being sent in by the mafia to fight the army, basically to hold territory. There's a big fight scene where he takes down this massive cannon that Todd McFarlane nicknames the Silver God, which is very funny. We never see that again. That's just Todd. Todd doing a little world building. And it's established that Overtkill is the primary enforcer of the Italian mafia. He's the guy they call when they can't call anybody else. He's the biggest big gun they have. And he's not subtle. He's not like a John Wick in a suit by any stretch of the imagination. If you could imagine the literal, he looks like a disco space pirate. He's 30 feet tall, basically. He's the biggest man in the world. He has a giant cybernetic eye, these huge pointy shoulder pads. He's got a built-in antenna. The rest of him looks like a 1980s Legionnaire. He's got circles all over him.
I do like Stan's question to Rob while he is creating him, which is just, how does he get dressed in the morning?
Yeah, which is such a Stan Lee thing to think about. How does he get dressed in the morning? How does he put on his trousers and hop on his bicycle?
It's a ridiculous design, but it is, and especially the colors, because it is like blue and white, it'll never
Yeah,
not seem like Cable.
it's that silver, white, teal kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so, but yes, it's not subtle. It's honestly, it's kind of a pretty cool 90s design. The toy, it's very toyetic. You can tell that Todd had that in mind basically from the jump, because it stands out. And as I recall, this toy was also huge. Like, all the Spawn toys were big, but this one was one of the like huge ones. It was a huge
Yeah.
one. Overkill
If
was
I
a huge one.
if I had any of them, I would have. I mean, this is totally the kind of toy villain you want to fight your action figures, so I get it.
Exactly. I think his head popped off or something too.
Oh, perfect. I would hope his arm pops off. I mean, given what's going to happen later, but
Yeah.
I guess if you try hard enough, all action figures' heads and arms pop off. So
Yeah, that's unfortunately true.
we kind of move on, and we are in an alleyway, and some other mob
Speaking of Rob
guys.
Liefeld, this guy's got the sniffles.
Yeah, but there's two kind of like mafia guys that are getting information from somebody who lives in one of the alleys of New York. Obviously, they've heard that Spawn sort of hangs out in the alleyways, so they're looking for him. And these guys are also not super subtle. I mean, I think every time they interview somebody in the issue, they kill them.
Yeah, pretty much that's their deal. Is they're like fixers for a man who we will speak about momentarily. A big presence in this comic, both as a story and a history. This guy, his name's Freddy, and he's sniffling and he's begging for 10 ounces of their best powder. And they're like, yeah, sure, whatever you want, but just tell us where Spawn is. Because Eddie's established that he knows, oh, sorry, Freddy's established he knows where the guy who ripped out all the Mafia Don's hearts is. So they promise him the Coke, and this is definitely a very, let's say, well caricatured portrait of a person on cocaine. It was the late 80s, early 90s. Everyone knew what that was like. When I say that, what I mean is he sniffs at a lot of the right intervals.
I also like that Orzakowski puts the sniffles in a different color.
Exactly.
I don't know. It's
Like,
kind of fun.
yeah, no, it's definitely hyperbolic and exaggerated. It's not. It's cartoonish, and meant to be. But it ends with another piece of Tom Orzakowski lettering as storytelling, where it just says "bang" with some blood splatter, and you know that Freddy's not getting that 10 ounces of their best powder.
Yeah, so as we kind of move on, this is where the scenes get kind of like staccato and they're just like one page, one page, one page. I almost think that's partly to just give room to the fight scene like later on that Todd is just like, I got to slam through a little bit of story here and I got to set up some characters that you haven't really met before and kind of move through some things. But he actually has the next page is we meet the sort of, mafia boss,
Named.
and this is Tony Twist, but we don't find out his name on this page.
That's right. That's right. But that will become important in a moment.
Yeah. And they kind of just tell him like, oh, the guy that we're looking for, he lives in the alleyways. They're just sort of the thing that we just saw. They're just explaining, which that's not the part that I like about the storytelling here, which is like we're just getting kind of a repetitive page, even though a new character is finding this out. It's the next scene because Spawn's back in his alleyway, and the other folks that live there are starting to wonder why Spawn's around all the time and what his deal is, because they do see themselves as a little community. And they
Yeah.
are like, well, listen, if you're going to be here, like, what's your deal? Like,
Yeah. Come be
why
part
don't
of
you
the
talk
gang.
to us?
And it's in some ways it is an almost compassionate look at the unhoused people that live in Spawn's alley, the set of alleys where he stays. In many ways it's very compassionate and kind of humanizing, which won't last long in this story.
Well,
But
yeah.
it never does. But yeah, it's Spawn basically getting to know these guys a little bit, and he is monologuing to himself about how incredible it is that they have their own needs and their own lives, and it's almost like this feels like Spawn almost rediscovering compassion in his on life. Rediscovering that connection with humanity for the first time since he became a monster, basically.
Yeah, and it's great because we did spend 4 issues. We sort of mentioned this in the first when we talked about those issues where it's just like he just kind of yells about the same thing the entire time, like, oh, he's no longer human, or he like, his face is unrecognizable. Oh, he misses his wife. And so it's nice for him to like take a little bit of a break from that and actually acknowledge the folks around him who like to this point haven't really busted his balls too much about sort of invading their alley.
Right.
you
And they'll
know?
bust his balls a little bit coming up in this issue. There's again some very not 2024 stuff in here, but that's all right because this was written
Yeah.
in 1993. So,
Yeah.
you
We
know.
do get the power meter again, which I think is more of just a reminder. He hasn't used any powers at this point in the issue, think it's just like, oh, hey, the power meter still exists. That's going to become relevant a little bit later, and I think that's why.
Yeah.
But Spawn does decide to explain his deal to the folks in the alleyway, which means that we get another recap of his origin.
Fortunately, this one's relegated to a single page. It's set against, some close-up shots of Wanda, his ex-wife, his widow, Cyan, her child with Terry Fitzgerald. And yes, that's the same name as the editor or whatever I think is credited by this point of Spawn.
He's a story consultant.
Story consultant, thank you. Who I believe is Todd McFarlane's best friend. And like with Wanda and Cyan, the funny thing is, in this telling, it says that Terry Fitzgerald is the only one who could take care of Wanda better than Al, which is
Right.
meant to build on that tragedy that now that he's out of her life, she has everything she ever wanted, which is a child that he couldn't give her. And, it's not an inelegant page full of words, but it is just, again, a recap of basically Spawn spending 4 issues going, my wife.
Yeah, now he just gets one page of that, and I do think that the thing I like about this page is that it is him in retelling the story. I think him sort of saying it out loud to somebody else. He has to kind of make these admissions. Where in the first arc, when we first meet him, he's so upset about what's happened, and he's kind of in shock. Now he's starting to bargain a little bit. He's starting to accept, like, well, if she's going to be with anybody, it might as well be with Terry. That's pretty good. He does mention something like that in the first arc as well, but here it feels like he believes it a little bit more now that he's like seen them together already.
You're starting to get that, like, this is what Todd McFarlane believes would somehow be the honorable thing, would be like, if you can't have Al in your life, you want the person closest to him. It seems to be like a way to also make the reader feel sympathetic to Wanda instead of any resentment towards her for moving on within 5 years of Al's death, which is probably a reasonable time if someone dies. I don't know. But we
Yeah.
get another shot. We get, after this, we come back to these hitmen who are tracking Spawn, and there's a page where they find another, alley dweller. They kill him, and they count out that they've now killed 5 people on the trail. The next page has a fun bit of storytelling that I actually like. It's a very kind of Spider-Man bit of storytelling where, or maybe even spiritually kind of a Batman sort of bit, where you see one of the mobsters walking, and there's these 3 kind of tight panels along across the page. One of the mobsters walking through the alley, talking to his buddy behind him, and his buddy's responding. He's responding, and then suddenly Spawn is responding. And the guy turns around, and he's face to face with Spawn, full cape out, chains blazing glory, basically telling him, your friend is dead. It's just you and me, coward, and now I want to know who's after me and why. And
Well, and I
he
like
even
too
mocks
that
the
he mocks his speech pattern too by adding a "you know what I mean" at the end,
yeah.
which is really fun. But also, I think this is the moment in this book where I was like, wait, who's this Spawn? This Spawn is actually like kind of fun, and like it is a little Spider-Man, it is a little Batman, which again we've talked about how those are big influences on what this character is. But it really feels like Todd leaning into it because as opposed to the Billy Kincaid story, and really as opposed to the first arc questions as well, this is where it's like, this is a superhero book. This feels like if you just plugged in Spidey or Batman, it's not really, you don't have to write that different of a book
No.
overall.
And I think some of the elegance in that storytelling is that he does get that humanizing moment just a few minutes before, a few pages before this, where he's making company with these people, with the alley dwellers again. And that's more of a human connection. And that's also him coming out of the darkness of basically having brutally murdered the child killer, Billy Kincaid. So he's come through this sort of dark night of the soul of that and learning of all the truth of what happened to his widow after his death. With all the powers that he does have, the one power he doesn't have is that he can't return to looking like his original self. He's now, like you said, bargaining and accepting a little bit with reaccepting a little bit of humanity and also stepping up as the protector of these alleys and the people in them, sort of the most downtrodden people in the story possible.
Yeah. I'm happy to see that because I do think that the act in that first arc was kind of getting a little long in the tooth. And it is nice to kind of see. I think also it's probably boring to write, like continuously tortured guy. So I like that we're moving on. It's times like that little bit where you're like, oh, right, this guy wrote and drew Spider-Man.
Right.
And it's just so nice to see.
A little bit of that
Um,
superhero pacing. And so
yeah.
we're getting closer and closer to this fight with Overtkill, and there's this really hilarious kind of entrance scene for him next, where the Mafia Council is all voting to go ahead and, yes, we're going to bring in Overtkill from a Sicily, and they're all going to voting to whack him. And there's this one guy down here who says, "Let him live," I say. Just kidding, slaughter him. And he's got this really distinct kind of wide smile that we'll see again later on in this issue. And I'm not sure if it's the same character, but I believe that it is. You'll correct me if I'm wrong when it comes
I
up again.
actually don't know, but we'll talk about it.
Either way, the next page introduces more of the mob boss, the boss of bosses, the guy who's bringing in Overtkill. Once again, he explains they think that Spawn is a young blood, which are, government superheroes, basically. The funny thing here is that they're all saying, like, all the other mobsters are saying, like, there's no way he's coming here, right? I heard he's as big as house. He wouldn't fit through the door. And just as he's saying that, the wall in the back says crinkle, and then boom, in a huge silhouette shaped hole in the wall leaps Overtkill. And our mob boss here is just delighted by this grand entrance, while his hitmen are just like, oh my gosh, I can't believe he ripped a hole in the boss's like skyscraper penthouse wall.
Yeah, so we've already met Overtkill at this point, and we kind of know what he's capable of. These guys don't. He's not like anything that they seem to have, but they're sending him out on this mission. And as soon as we move on, Spawn lets us know that another homeless person has been murdered. And even though he didn't know that person, he's upset that these people are dying because of their association with him. And he's going to make that right. And yeah, then we get to some fighting, which there's been unfortunately not enough of in
There's been
Spawn
a
to this
lot
point.
of like talking about what Spawn is and a lot of reinforcing that. A lot of world building at all costs in a lot of ways. I like this first page here where they're finally getting together. And one thing that I really like about it is I love that last panel of Overtkill showing himself as he bursts out of this warehouse. And he says, "Ha, good one, American." And he keeps calling Spawn American. He says, "Good one, American." And he's from Sicily, which so I'm just led to believe that he does have a Sicilian accent. I never really put that together as a kid, but it really paints the entire way you see this fight and you see this character in a very Todd McFarlane kind of way.
Is it good or bad that Todd didn't go full Claremont with the accent?
I can't tell because I don't know if he's meant to have an accent or not. I saw The Beekeeper this weekend, and there's a scene where Jason Statham, who has a very thick British accent, is talking to this person, and she says to him, "Do I detect a hint of the British Isles hiding in your accent?"
What?
And that's very much the vibe I'm getting here. Is like, what
Oh
accent is
boy.
he supposed to have? But I don't know. Doesn't matter. The thing I like about this panel is it's first of all, Overtkill looks very anime in this panel. Like he looks
Mm,
very much like a Ninja Scroll villain, and also that very heavy black like chiaroscuro kind of look is very Mike Mignola, and it's not
yeah.
something you see Todd do a whole lot in the fight scenes with Spawn.
Yeah, we've kind of touched on it before that maybe just shading things in a lot of black or inking things in a lot of black makes finishing the page go a lot faster. In this case, I don't think that that's the what he's going for.
No, it's very noir,
It's like legitimately cool.
and it
His
shapes the
entrance.
page in a cool way. With
It
like,
also it looks like he's kind of bursting out of the page,
yeah, exactly.
which is really really cool.
There's
I
a
don't know
lot.
if you have it this way in the compendium, but for me, that page is on the left hand side. So the right hand page is, with his like arm busting out. It kind of
Yeah,
works that way too,
it
where
does.
you can imagine that his arm is bursting out of this broken debris as well. I don't know. It's cool. It like,
Well, and on the next page, that arm forms a crucial part of the storytelling because once again, it's sort of the part of that diegetic panel border where it's gripping Spawn's cape. And it's a very interesting kind of effect because you have the top panel of the page is Overtkill facing Spawn. Spawn's cape kind of wrapping all the way off panel, back around to form kind of a border with the bottom two panels where Overtkill's hand is gripping it again. So just by bringing in his hand, you get a little more motion between where they're at and what they're doing, but it also has a very kind of surrealist effect where you're seeing many angles of both of these characters kind of at once. And I think that that's cool.
I think it works really well, and it's a good, again, it's a fun bit of storytelling that Todd's going to use as we get to the conclusion of this issue.
Yeah, where
Where like,
Overkill throws him by the cape.
yeah, exactly. And so like, I mean, I guess it's that Incredibles joke too, right?
Yeah,
Like
no capes.
no capes. Moving into like the next double page spread though.
This is honestly legitimately a little funny to me.
Like where he's mocking the chains is really, really funny. He's
Yeah,
like the chains are wrapped around him and
all
he's like,
around his
oh,
neck.
magic chains, help me, I'm dying, I can't breathe. And then he's just laughing, get real. And then Spawn's just like, I don't know why my chains did that. I didn't try to use any power.
That's the first hint that we're going to get throughout this issue, several hints about how Spawn's costume is alive. That pays off a little more in the second half of the Billy Kincaid arc, where you learn that the costume is a symbiote that is sort of alive. It's a neural symbiote, and they have kind of name, number designations. But once again, there'll be several hints throughout this story about what the nature of Spawn's costume is.
Yeah. And so Overtkill is pretty in control of this fight until he tries to squish, like a Looney Tunes character, tries to squish Spawn between two giant gears in this.
Gear
I
wear
don't.
in the gear
Where are they?
factory.
They're in a warehouse, like on a dock, I guess. Like
Yeah,
that's kind of what it looks like. It's not established. I mean, we see the gears earlier, so they are there. I guess it's could be like an auto shop. Maybe I have no
it
idea.
is certainly a factory full of large gears like that Charlie Chaplin movie.
Yeah.
And he tries to shove him in there, but Spawn goes, "Gotta duck now," just as this big meaty robot cyborg hand, another classic Todd McFarlane set of fingers, reaches for him to throw him in the cogs, these giant cogs. Spawn goes, "Gotta duck," and Overkill goes, as his hand goes past Spawn's head and gets crushed in the gears, and it basically rips his entire cyborg arm off.
Right, which is what leads. Which I don't know how Spawn didn't necessarily notice this before, but this is where Spawn realizes that he's a cyborg. Like, I'm not sure what you think a guy that looks like that is.
Yeah,
I
well,
guess I guess he could be wearing armor or whatever, but
yeah, his goggles and his little antenna implant have straps on them, which is kind of just a cool character design. It's very Cyclopsy in a way, very Jim Lee Cyclopsy in a way.
yeah.
But yeah, Spawn's like, "Oh, a freaking cyborg."
He mentions that he's fought them before, and they kind of keep fighting. Overtkill uses his own chains and calls him a young blood again, and
Oh yeah, that's the thing about Overtkill is that he wears gold chains around his wrists.
yeah, and so he chokes Spawn with his chains, but then he
This
thinks.
storytelling's a little chaotic too. We're using Spawn's cape a lot to drag the action around the page, but it kind of overlaps between the two pages as well. It's a little frenetic.
Yeah, I'll say too that a couple of the close-ups, it's not entirely clear what you're looking at. Like that first panel, like come on, fight. Well, the chains are just the Spawn color chains, so it just looks like nothing necessarily. Like
Right,
like
there's not
it's
a
just
lot
like, all
going
right,
on
that's
there.
like Spawn's neck, okay.
I do think it's funny that he's like that's the one like mafia guy affectation he has is these like gold dookie ropes around his arms.
But yeah, I mean, I do like that as this fight continues, the panel borders become bloody, and then the final panel is like shattered as Overtkill thinks that he's killed Spawn, but Spawn pretty quickly tells us that he's like lets us know that he's alive through the narration, and that like some of the cyborg stuff is
His
malfunctioning and just
external life sensors, which I guess is kind of like, okay, if you're a robot, I'm sure you can still, or a cyborg, I'm sure you can still observe, whatever signs of life. But Spawn's already also dead, so
right.
like the whatever it is, Todd McFarlane decided he needed a reason that Overtkill specifically would believe that Spawn was dead.
Yeah. Interestingly, he does use his powers here and says, "Oh, I got to drain more power so he can heal his broken right arm." We don't get a power meter this
No, we
time.
don't get another power meter until well into the next issue.
And then we get like the quickest bit of storytelling needed to happen to get us to a final splash that I think I've ever seen.
Yeah.
A comic do where basically it's like later that night, Spawn travels to an army base. His lifespan as a mercenary didn't end with any shortage of well-kept secrets. And then he's like, so he breaks into an army base that I guess is in New York. And
New York Army base.
I mean, listen, Coast Guard is based in Bayonne, so that's
Well, and
close-ish.
God knows they're
That's New
armed to the
Jersey, though.
fucking teeth, I'm sure.
Yeah. And then, yeah, then we get, Commando Spawn. He's got a bunch of guns. He's got a bandolier, bullets.
Speaking of Liefeld, he's got some very huge cable-like Liefeldian like sci-fi guns. Very,
Yep.
very specifically, I don't say that lightly, like they look like Liefeld guns very specifically with the double barrel ends and like the one in his right hand, the smaller, or in his left hand, sorry, the smaller pistol sized one looks like Cable's holding it on the cover of an X Force issue, except he's got his finger like on the trigger and his hand is shaped to the handle of the gun because Todd McFarlane vaguely knows how a human hand holding a gun looks.
I think the larger one in his right hand looks okay.
Yeah,
The
it's
small one looks odd. Also, I guess this army base had a lot of extra pouches, specifically like thigh and forearm pouches.
well, that's where a commando puts their stuff. You can't be
I
weighed
guess
down
so.
by like what cargo pants. That's what they should have had. What if that was the trend? Not pouches for superheroes, but cargo pants for superheroes in the 90s. Jim Lee's Cyclops outfit, but instead of like yellow trunks, it's just yellow cargo shorts.
Listen, I know we clown on the 90s artists for the pouches thing, but really we got to blame Art Adams
That's fair. I
because
mean,
Longshot is the original pouch boy.
the original Pouch Boy. That was the
And
name of his mixtape, as I recall.
here's the thing though, Longshot, if he was created in the 90s, would 100% wear cargo shorts.
That's true. That is true. So, yeah, we end with this kind of sick house splash page where Spawn's just saying, I'm better than that. And he's holding a massive wealth of guns, an entire militia's like armament of guns, which leads to honestly, it's super sick. I like that the bandolier goes over the cape for some reason. Like, he wasn't even wasting time to take the cape off. He's like,
Just
fuck it,
throw it
it's
on.
going around. Capes get like this really, in a lot of ways, does become kind of the prototype for the alt Spawn, where this is Spawn
Yeah.
with guns, and later on there's a Commando Spawn action figure. There's so many Spawn action figures with guns at this point, but there are even ones that look almost exactly like this, where he's got the pouches and the bandoliers and the huge sci-fi guns and stuff.
Spawn ends up being toyetic in the way that like Batman is. Remember all the 90s like Batman toys too? It's like
Oh
Arctic
yeah,
Chill Batman and you're like,
yeah,
"What is
yeah.
this? Does
Volcano
he ever
Sunrise
exist?"
Batman.
Or the Luge one
Yeah,
that they
hell yeah.
I think they make fun of the Luge one in Batman Brave and the Bold,
I think they did, but
and it's very very funny.
that was such a huge part of being a kid in the 90s was those, because they had one Batman mold and they would just paint it neon green this time, and now he's jungle radiation Batman or whatever. give him a weird new accessory that shoots a rocket, and I had a bunch of those. I mean, I
Yeah,
think a lot of kids did.
of
Which,
course. And also, I mean, that was every toy line, right?
yeah,
He-Man did the
oh
same
yeah,
thing.
absolutely.
Ninja Turtles did the same thing. It
Oh
was like,
yeah,
all right,
Infinite
these
Ninja
dumb kids
Turtles.
will keep buying it.
Those
So
Batman ones are kind of fun because in a way they reflect back to the '50s Batmans, where like he was a different Batman every issue. Anyway, we're talking about Spawn, and the fun thing about this splash page also is that the opening page of issue number 7 is also a splash page, and it looks to me basically like Todd McFarlane just was like, I'm gonna redraw the exact same page from memory. Like
yeah,
that's what it looks like.
this brings us to Spawn number 7, Payback Part 2. Stories, pencils, and inks by Todd McFarlane. Letters and editor Tom Orzechowski. Story consultant Terry Fitzgerald. Color by Steve Oliff, Ruben Rude, and Oli Optics. This one dedicated to Rob Liefeld, co-creator of Overkill. It says co-creator of Overkill, and that's where he's Overkill again, and not Overtkill.
The one time in his
Very.
life Todd McFarlane thought about what a name could cost him. And we're going to get to that in this issue, this very issue. I've been excited to talk about this. It's coming up in the next few pages. But yeah, so this opening splash page looks like Todd McFarlane was like, I'm going to draw the exact same page last time from memory. Or like, if there's some convention artists who always draw Batman have like a stock Batman pose and they'll whip one of those out. It looks like that. Like this is the stock gun Spawn. And this one looks like the Xerox of a Xerox of a Xerox of the last one. Like
The
this is
thing is,
the
I think his hands are better in this one.
his hands are a little better, but it's a little less detailed. The head is a little less well proportioned. You can tell that he was like, I'm gonna draw the same guns, but they're not exactly the same. The crate is on on the other side. It's just kind of a fun artifact of the production schedule of comics and Todd McFarlane's love of opening an issue of Spawn exactly where the last one left off.
Yeah, because we're gonna find out that through 6 issues, right? On issue 7, it has been 3 weeks. It has only been 3 weeks in Spawn of Al Simmons being Spawn. That's how this story opens, and and it also gives reasoning behind the guns. Basically, he doesn't want to use his powers anymore. He already knows how to use guns and he knows how to kill cyborgs. So why would he use his hell powers? That'll kill him again. He's going to use guns because guns are cool.
One thing that's interesting on the next page is that I think Todd forgot to draw his eye designs in that top panel, but it does foreshadow times later when Spawn's face is blacked out or he doesn't have that.
Yeah, that's definitely super weird. It feels like they're kind of there,
Yeah,
but
it's an
yeah,
artistic choice, I think. Maybe I'll give him that credit instead of saying he just forgot.
I
But
mean, no prize. Maybe the the suit decided it didn't want to have eye things.
yeah, I wanted to be more dramatic and look more like blended in with the shadows in that moment. It knew that the
Sure.
reader would be viewing that. We'll give him that. Anyway, he's basically just talking about how fucking strapped he is and how like if you come for him, he will beat the crap out of you. He says, "I could have blown the crap out of him with my powers, but lucky for me, his external life sensors went haywire." So we're just recapping his comic book science went kablooey, and I managed to escape with my own life.
The second page has one of my favorite captions in all these issues so far, which is partly because I don't think it's a great line, but it must have been fun to write and just go, I hope Todd said to himself, like, fuck yeah. And somewhere in hell, a childlike grin crosses the face of evil.
That is
Like,
such a Todd McFarlane proud of himself
hell yeah.
line. Yeah, he sat down. He got up from the typewriter that day and was like, "That one's good. That one's going in." So so Spawn does a new trick here, which is teleportation, and it's not like just regular teleportation because the next page describes how Spawn's every molecule is ripped apart one by one, meshed together with the existing molecular structures present. They're then vacuumed, sucked at the speed of light to a preordained location, then reassembled as fiercely as they were separated. Essentially, that is just Star Trek
I was gonna say
transporter
Star Trek.
technology. Yeah. So you can thank Spawn for that, Trekkies. He invented it.
He does throw up as soon as he gets there.
Yes.
Then the friendly folks in the alleyway.
Yeah, Bobby. Old Bobby shows up. Now
Yep.
this is where the portrayal of the unhoused starts to get a little less charitable. He kind of is like, "Oh, you think Spawn's drunk because he's drunk," and Spawn's just like, "No, no, I just need a minute." But he's just all over Spawn. He is talking about how drunk he is, how drunk he wants Spawn to get with him, and then he asks him, "Why are you always parading around in that queer-looking outfit?"
Yeah, there's like a weird little like
Had to have a little 90s homophobia in there.
yeah.
And later he calls him a fruitcake. For a minute I was like, well, maybe Todd was just using a very Canadian way of saying weird. But
Yeah, no. Unfortunately, like we've said in past episodes already, like a few things that just don't age very well for the 2024 lens that weren't good at the time, but they were just
very
normal at the
culturally
time.
relevant at
Yeah.
the time and very culturally prevalent. And it's funny to me, I don't know that we've come through one issue yet that didn't have something that was just like, okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even the
And
Alan
that's
Moore, even the one that Alan Moore wrote, which, Alan Moore. So,
honestly could have been worse since it yeah, it could have been worse since it was an Alan Moore issue
yeah.
in terms of things that maybe wouldn't age well.
But he takes off Spawn's mask and sees that he basically looks like burnt charcoal. It's a very Deadpool kind of thing, where his face is very burned up and scarred and pockmarked, and basically just looks like he's been roasted in the pits of hell.
Yeah.
And Bobby's like, "Well, you're ugly as shit, bud."
But the thing that Spawn notes is that he's really been accepted. That like none of the folks that live in the alleyways, they've just accepted him as one of their own. And so like while Bobby's turns of phrase leave something to be desired, he's being friendly, and Spawn does recognize that, and like even he makes fun of him kind of the way you might make fun of your friend
He's
towards the
busting
end.
his balls, like we said.
Yeah,
You know. So the next page, and this is something important.
here we go.
Here we go. This caption introduces the boss of bosses, the mob boss that we've been seeing, who commands Overtkill. We catch up with him and we finally learn his name. And his name is, let's say it together. 1, 2, 3, Vito
Antonio Twist.
Gravano.
Oh,
Oh, well, isn't that interesting? So, here's a little story. In the reprinted editions of Spawn, the character of Antonio Twistelli, who is the big mob boss of the story, is renamed as Don Vito Gravano. The reason why we discussed this in the first episode, but we'll get a little more in depth right now. The TLDR version is that Todd McFarlane loved to name characters in Spawn after people that he knew and admired in his life and in his world. Like we discussed earlier this episode, Terry Fitzgerald was his best friend. The name of Spawn's widow, Wanda, and his widow's daughter, Cyan, are the name of Todd McFarlane's widow and actual daughter.
not his widow,
Or
his
sorry,
wife.
his wife, not his widow.
Oh boy.
Sorry, no, his wife, Todd McFarlane's. Well, someday, maybe. We'll see.
Oh, I hope not.
Well, maybe he'll get to be Spawn.
All right.
That's
I
all
think
I
that
meant.
he's hoping that won't happen.
Oh, that's fair enough. You can never tell. But so he named the mob boss here Antonio Twistelli after a real guy named Tony Twist, who was a hockey player. Toddster loves hockey. He's definitely a jock. He loves sports. So one day, supposedly, the story goes, apocryphally, and I don't know if this part is exactly true, but this is the way it's told, is that Tony Twist's mom sees a Spawn comic and finds out that, or sees an episode of the Spawn cartoon, and sees that the character of the mob boss is named Tony Twist, just like her son. She calls him and says, "Why'd you let these people name a mob boss after you?" And he says, "Well, I didn't." Takes Todd McFarlane to court. and I think the judgment was something like $170 million in favor of Tony Twist for like defamation. It basically tore Todd McFarlane's nascent budding empire apart, cost him a ton of money. Image Comics was in danger. There's a whole backlash to this, and Todd fixed it by getting into toys.
The thing that's really interesting too is that the real Tony Twist, like he found out about this, and he from his mom, and he actually ended up watching Spawn the animated series, and that's a little bit of what set him off specifically. The quote is, "I'm in pink thong underwear, smoking a cigar, ordering the kidnapping of a child while two women are naked on the couch making love to each other. I obviously didn't want any part of it. Even if I
Any
was a
part of
good
it?
guy, even if I was a good guy, I wouldn't have participated. You got kids being kidnapped, you got nudity. It's nothing I want to be affiliated with."
Interesting
And
story. I have that episode on VHS. That was my mom gave me that for Christmas one year when I was like 12 or whatever it came out.
the perfect age really to watch it.
When I shows what I yeah,
He was initially awarded $24.5
that's what
million
it was.
in the year
Little
2000.
little less than I said, but
But it was revised. He won 15 it got revised to 15 million in 2004, and then it was upheld, and then they settled for 5 million in 2007.
that took a long time. That was
Yeah,
like almost 10 years of litigation or something like that at that point.
exactly.
So,
And he said in 2020, he said he followed up on it, and he said, "I did not despise Todd in any way, shape, or form. Not at all. He thought that this was a First Amendment issue where he had the right to do whatever." And so this is where we really just start to understand that there's some part of Todd that's just like, "Oh, if I can throw it in there because it's just a thing. It's a person I know."
Todd often seems to mean very well and
Right.
think and plan to do right by people. And I think his attitude, and it shows somewhat here, is if I mean well, this is an homage, then it'll be fine.
Yeah.
You know? And he didn't create that episode of the Spawn animated series. Like, that was, I think, even an escalation from what's in the comic.
I believe that's Alan McElroy wrote most of those episodes, and also was the showrunner. What's funny is his connection to Overtkill is that Alan McElroy will write issues 23 and 24 of Curse of Spawn, where we get some backstory on Overtkill that
We meet a Hisanona.
we'll get to it at some we'll get to it in a few episodes, but may or may not be canon based on what is presented.
Yeah, we'll find out when we get there. But so that's the story of Tony Twist. What ended up saving Todd's empire and allowing to get through a lot of litigation in the next few years, and also to buy a few very expensive baseballs, was getting into toys. And it's interesting how interwoven the thought of having a toy empire based around Spawn with having the Spawn comic, with all these legal troubles, with everything else, kind of winds up being, because the Spawn toys and McFarlane toys winds up being really what lets Todd McFarlane have 350 issues of Spawn right now.
Yeah, 100%. We've mentioned that there are definitely fallow periods within the Spawn publishing calendar,
The run.
where there's periods of time where this is a book that sold 1.7 million copies with its first issue that less than 10 years later can barely sell 30,000. I think that speaks a little bit to Image Comics as a whole. Image Comics not being the powerhouse that it was early on because it got old, right? Like anything else does. But similarly, the public interest in Spawn kind of drops off. So yeah, the toy empire, which now has DC licenses and whatnot, is really the thing that allowed Spawn to continue. And it's interesting because I don't think we really talk about creator-owned comics in that way, where they're kind of supplemented by something else. Sometimes we do,
Yeah,
but
I mean, Teenage Mutant Ninja
usually,
Turtles is kind of the prototype multimedia empire, and you can tell. I mean, there are even times when Todd is directly gunning for for their records set by like the sales of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles #1 and some of
Yeah.
their toys and things like that. And it's you can see the direct parallel where he looks at Eastman and Laird and they have this essentially a multimedia empire based around their weird little comic, and he sees that and says to himself, well, why can't I do that? Why do I need Marvel? I don't need a whole line of 30 titles. I need one title that does as well or
Well,
better
I
than
think
any of
also,
those.
and I'd be interested to ask Todd about this specifically with regards to the Turtles. I wonder if he considers Eastman and Laird with the Jack Kirby's and Steve Ditko's and the, creators who he think kind of got the raw end of the deal.
Yeah, because it is a complicated legacy, even with you know the ongoing success of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Like certainly Eastman and Laird themselves at this point are not raking in what could be considered a hugely significant part of like the $1 billion merchandise sales or whatever.
Yeah. Well, and Laird is pretty not involved in the Turtles
No,
really at
he's
all.
made his peace and moved on. I think
Yeah.
Kevin Eastman
Well,
does
and
a
they
lot.
weren't even friends for a portion of time as well.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Well,
this is not
this
a
is a
Ninja
whole
Turtle
different
podcast.
podcast. Yeah. Sorry. You can see it. It's so easy though when you start talking about Spawn to get into these other things, these nostalgic things, because the toys and the comics and the HBO show and the movie and everything were such a part of pretty much any comic reader's life. Whether you were into Spawn or even these kind of comics, you were aware of it and it was driving a portion of the industry in a significant way.
Well, and not to go backwards too much, but the last issue, and we've talked a bit about how these early issues are sort of Todd, throwing the gauntlet a little bit. The end of issue 6 is, I think, of the way that he thinks about any of this. Right? Spawn says, "I'm better than that." Right? That's kind of that's kind of Todd's ethos a little bit, right? Is like I'm better than the guys they got at Marvel now, right? I'm better and I don't need them. And so I don't know. I think it's interesting. I might be reading between the lines a little bit too much and reading into it
No,
a
I
little bit
think
too much,
you're
but that's
right.
part of the fun of it.
I mean, I think in the sense that Spawn is on some levels a Todd McFarlane self-insert anti-hero, like you know, it, he ties it so much to his own personal life and his personality that I think it's kind of impossible not to read it at least a little bit that way.
Yeah.
So getting back, we see that Overtkill, as we said, tells Tony Twist or Vito Gravano, as he is renamed, which is interesting because he still can't help himself from borrowing the name Gravano from Sammy the Bull Gravano.
Yeah.
He just can't help himself a little bit. But
I mean, there's only so many Italian names.
that's right. There's 3, 4, and they're all mafia names. So yeah, basically Overkill saying I can't go home to Sicily yet because my arm it is broken. But Tony Twist's like, great, whatever, it's good. You did a great job. It explains that his nickname is Dracula in addition to Tony Twist.
Right.
His nickname is Dracula because he lives to suck the power out of everything. We
It's
get
like, all right.
Spawn having a flashback nightmare where he's seeing this. He's trying to remember in his nightmare what happened when he died. He knows he was betrayed somehow by Jason Wynn, his old spy master, but he doesn't know who killed him, who did the deed, or how or why. And he has this vision of a skeleton saying, "Scum like you makes me sick. Even if they hadn't paid me for this, I'd have killed you for free." And honestly, this looks like exactly the kind of panel that someone would cut out and turn into a like band flyer. You know what I'm saying? It's sort of a literally skeletal memory of Spawn's death, where he received this monologue and was blasted in the face by a gun that looks like a hair dryer.
The thing I love about Todd McFarlane's skeletons is that they can emote.
Oh yeah, like Spider-Man's face. It's a
Or
sick
like
looking
Jack
skeleton.
Skellington.
Yeah, exactly. He's holding a fucking grenade too. Like hell
Yeah.
yeah, dude. So then Spawn wakes up from his nightmare and Bobby is there. And across town, Wanda wakes up and is having a parallel nightmare where she's also having a vision of Al Simmons' death, which establishes that she and everyone else, as we've seen before, thinks that Al Simmons, world famous government assassin, was killed in the line of duty for the United States, given public mourning, public honors. Nothing public is known about the fact that he was secretly assassinated. For we find out here having questions about the people he was being asked to kill.
Right. And I think a bummer on this page is that the nightmare seems to just be a bunch of bats. It almost feels like a placeholder.
It does. It looks like, yes. It
I
really
kind of
does.
wish that her nightmare was a little bit more linked to what he just saw.
Could have had a skull in there or something.
Yeah.
I kind of like this next page of Spawn splayed out in his cape in the alley talking to Bobby and basically saying, "My very existence is putting you in danger." And he says, "I can't let them take any more."
Spawn is basically saying, this is what I need to do to protect the alleyways. Like, my very existence puts you in danger, which we've kind of seen him say already.
Bobby says, "This stinking garbage ain't worth fighting for." And Spawn says, "No, but you are." So we see that he cares about the people. And that's really, again, cutting back to that humanity.
Yeah. And there's he keeps pushing again back against the hero moniker, but everything he does kind of seem heroic, considering he doesn't kill good people.
Right. Well, and he also says here, "I'm no hero," and that's kind of paralleled by when he meets Overtkill again. Overtkill keeps saying, "Hey, hero."
We do get a big moment. It's a small moment, but it is important, where he says time to streamline. He throws his cape away. I guess he's really meaning to just leave it in the alley because the cape's going to get in the way. He already got kind of swung around by it with Overtkill last time they fought, so he's trying to streamline.
And also,
And
Bobby thinks it makes him look like a fruitcake, and you can't really
yeah.
have that. Bobby's got pretty big opinions. Anyway.
But we get that last panel that says, as Spawn walks away, lost in the clattering of guns and ammo, neither he nor Bobby notice the cape as it slithers after them.
So that's another one of those hints that Spawn's costume, like the chains acting on their own, has something of its own consciousness, hinting at the fact that it's a symbiote that we'll learn. This next page is really interesting. In the one of the early issues, Spawn reunited with his wife, Wanda, in his new illusory human form, which is that of a white man. Al Simmons was a black man in life. When he tries to take the form of his old self, he becomes a generic looking white surfer dude, as he's called. And he goes and says he's with the SPCA and he's looking for Wanda's dog license. So she goes to an SPCA office and the guy says, "Well, that guy would have been in a different district, but if he was, I don't know how he heard about your job." Then he says something weird about his ears. Wanda gets distracted, lost in thought, thinking about why this guy would have come to her house asking about her dog license. And this guy says, "Go ahead and stare at my ears. I've been called everything from." It's very strange. Like, he just comments on his own ears.
And this gets called out in a later panel or a later narration, but like he does kind of look like Ross Perot. I do like when Todd is like, I gotta make people look different, and so he just makes them look super weird.
Well, the thing that's interesting about it is she says, "Was that guy a government stiff or something more?" And that's when I thought he kind of looked like that mob boss in that one panel with the big weird smile and the same kind of like odd off kilter shaped head, which may just be Todd McFarlane only have so many ways of drawing like a weird caricature of a guy.
Hmm.
But I couldn't tell if it was the same guy or not. And the way she talks about it makes it oddly unclear what the hell's actually going on there.
So I think when she says, "Was that guy a government stiff?" I don't think she's talking about this guy. She's talking about Spawn.
Oh, you're right. She is.
Because
Man,
this guy can't be the guy from earlier. They do look similar. This guy has like a little bit of Reed
he does. He
Richards
does.
hair going
You're
on.
right. It's just a weird that her phrasing there combined with him being like, "It's okay to stare at my ears." Like, I don't
Right.
understand what that is. So I was like, I thought she was puzzling over why the hell that guy, because that's what I was puzzling over in that moment, was why the hell that guy was like, "Have a look at my ears," which probably is some weird Ross Perot meta commentary thing.
I think it's because she spends a whole panel not talking. There's no dialogue in the previous panel, and that's why she's like, "Oh, wait, what? I was just thinking of something else." Like I think we're meant to read a beat that's way too long because it takes
Yeah,
us
okay.
way too long to read that
The
panel. It's
storytelling
very
here
odd.
is just awkward combined with the art from earlier. So anyway, we're gonna move on now instead of spending 20 minutes on me not being able to read comics.
I remember my first comic.
Me too, bud. So Spawn also bursts into Tony Twist's office, which we learn is like 20 floors of guards that no one's ever been through. He puts another gun that looks like a hairdryer against Tony Twist's head. It's a massive one of these like cable
Wait,
guns.
is that the next page for you?
No, I guess I skipped a page. Sorry, I was
Oh.
just kind of
I'm just wondering because I know the compendium sometimes has different stuff because we get
That's fair.
a pretty nuts page where seemingly Spawn has made this gun bigger. It
Yes,
has not appeared this big before, but
it's
we
now
get
like 8 feet long, and he's posing with it, busting out from like between his legs. He's straddling it like a witch straddles a broom. And I don't
yeah.
know if there's any symbolism in this that Todd McFarlane intended.
Well, considering the cover also has him holding a gun at crotch level,
It's on someone's mind.
it's very masculine. Let's put it that way.
Well, he's better than that.
Right, that's true.
And so he's saying he's going to go kill a man named Dracula, Tony Twist. He busts into Tony Twist's office, which has all these floors of guards, tells Tony Twist to have Overtkill meet him at the pier at midnight. I guess because he wants to finish the job on Overtkill. But it's kind of a very funny moment because you'd think that since Overtkill was just in Tony Twist's office.
What's he doing?
Yeah.
What do you think Overtkill does like on his time off? And also where can he go as a one-armed cyborg?
I guess to the cyborg repair store.
Is there some equivalent of like the bar with no name in the Spawn universe?
The Italian restaurant with no name.
I'm just thinking because like we know that Savage Dragon and the Youngbloods exist, which then I guess means presumably the Max. Or do we ever find out if like the Max? Well, we know Shadowhawk is also in this universe.
Yeah.
Do we ever find out if the Max or Wildcats are also in this universe?
Well, I know there's
Wildcats
a Spawn
are.
Wildcats crossover at
Yeah,
some point.
Wildcats are.
Yeah, Wildcats.
Anyway,
it's all a big thing. I can't remember if Max was a part of any of that or not, but I think they did have Max crossover into some of those Image crossover events.
Would be a shame if he didn't.
We're set up for the rematch between Overtkill and Spawn, which is where we get another classic Overtkill entrance. This time his arm is all shattered, and he's saying, "Hey, hero." It's the quote from the top of the episode. Saying, "Shall we play?" And it's honestly another cool panel where he's appearing in the darkness. Very moody. It really sets the stage for this being like a big, grim, dangerous kind of fight. And I really like the way Todd has drawn his wrecked arm here. Like all the chunks hanging down and all the, wreckage and wires and stuff.
Spawn has, despite streamlining, he's not streamlined enough because he forgot about his chains, George.
Yes, he did.
So he just has another thing that Overtkill can use to swing him about because it felt so natural to be holding a gun again that he half forgot his new situation.
Yes, he did. And that is really some early Spawn prose. Like, that's pinnacle Spawn, like, prose. But, so he gets thrown around by the chains again, stabs Overtkill in the eye with a spike. It's a very, like, Terminator kind of move. And I think he even references the Terminator somewhere in here. He says he's got a Terminator.
Yeah, on the next panel, or on the next page, he says,
yeah, it must be terminated.
Yeah.
Overtkill.
Then it says, "You've scarred me for a second time. Can't have that." Overtkill blasts him with an arm cannon
that he now has. Yeah. He does generate an arm cannon, which, classic cyborg behavior to suddenly shoot a big ray gun. But in the next panel, he pulls off Spawn's mask just like Bobby did earlier. Spawn pulls off his own mask. This time showing him the face that Bobby saw earlier after pulling off his mask. And he says, take a good look. I'm patient. And Overkill just says, you look like crap.
Which, again, we talked about this with Malbolgia saying caca.
Yes,
I kind of wish people just said shit in this.
I know. You look like crap is better than if he had said you look like caca. But crap happens wouldn't be good. Crap happens sounds like a weatherman.
Then the fight basically just ends. We turn to a splash page, a sideways splash page, the most annoying kind. You
But
have to.
this one's freaking sick. First off, Spawn is standing in a way that is really ridiculous, especially considering the size of the gun that he's shooting. But we get a payoff panel of him blasting that cyborg apart, blasting Overkill apart with that massive Gigantor gun. So you actually do get to see him use it at the very least.
I know he's holding it right in front of. Overtkill didn't move. I don't know. I will say that as opposed, I think the first fight in 6 is better choreographed. This one is fine, and I think it's partly because guns are boring. I don't know. It feels weird from just go from standing in front of him to this really dynamic pose. I mean, it's a cool ass page, and it's funny he says bad joke.
Yeah, there is some storytelling lost in the drive for cool ass drawing. And as we've seen before in a lot of these issues, cool ass drawing wins out for Todd McFarlane over storytelling a lot of the time. And especially, even though this one is cool and it's well drawn, you get the sense that he just didn't want to do a 2-page spread, or maybe he just didn't want to print another page or cut a page from somewhere to make it a 2-page spread. So he was like,
Yeah.
it has to be horizontal, it has to be the whole page, it's got to be, this.
I guess it could have been a 2-page spread, but then it was I mean, there's ads and stuff, right? So
Exactly. So they probably need to cut a page. But
Yeah.
the choice to turn it horizontal is a little bit, it breaks the flow of the story a little bit, especially considering the break in storytelling from the page previously.
Oh, it also is the second time he's made us do this. The first time is in issue 1.
Yes.
But that one is a double page spread, so it's much more impactful because the size and turning it's like a single page spread, but
It makes
hey,
a
pay
massive,
attention.
yeah.
Yeah.
So the next
So
page, we get a little bit more Orzakowski magic, where we see this massive gun going bam, 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 bam. And then, honestly, Todd McFarlane draws a really sick, busted up cyborg.
yeah,
Like,
100%.
it almost looks like the skeleton that was like the cyborg version of the skeleton that Spawn was fighting in his dream earlier. Spawn on the next page looks absolutely demented. He's basically holding Overkill's charred spinal column and half of his face, and he's saying, "So who's laughing now? I fought your kind before. This is where the fun comes in."
He also kind of looks like Violator more.
Yeah, he does. That's true. He starts to look like Violator, and especially a little bit like Clown, considering, the way that his teeth and his eyes are
Yeah.
shaped here. There's a little bit of that demonic presence coming out, and he is taking a little bit of glee. Like he says, this is where the fun comes in. And it says Spong, Kank, Poing, Skishk, and it's Spawn ripping all the cybernetics off of this spinal column that was the man part of Overtkill. That's kind of the coolest part of the fight is him ripping the cyborg apart. And as cool as that gun panel, that page of him blasting him with the gun is, and as much as you get why he's doing the guns thing, it almost dials back Spawn a little bit in the sense
Hmm.
that we don't really see him use the powers. There was a power meter earlier, but it was just kind of a side panel. It was just sort of an aside showing that it still exists.
He doesn't have much time to revel in his handiwork
Yeah.
because the authorities are on their way. They made a lot of noise, but not before he sets the timer of an electromagnetic bomb.
So he gets the cool walking away from an explosion moment. Now this panel is a little weird. This is one that the composition's a little strange to me. He's kind of down in the corner where you can tell he's huddling and running. It's not quite the like triumphant like Denzel Washington walking away from a cloud of fire kind of like triumphant feeling that, but he is dragging about 4,000 pounds of chains and a gun the size of a Buick. So you forgive it a little bit.
Yeah. And that's this arc. That's Payback parts 1 and 2. George, what are your overall thoughts? So this is really technically the way that we're covering it, it ends up being sort of like the third arc.
In a way, yeah. And
And I
I mean,
guess
it truly
technically
is
it
the third.
is.
Yeah, it is. I think it's like I like that at the end it says he's slipping away to his alley, and how he'll curl up behind some rusty dumpster for a long, comfortable night. Rusty Dumpster, burlesque name for whoever wants it.
It's pretty good.
Yeah, I honestly, it's got some storytelling hiccups and some pacing issues, I think. But all of that said, I kind of enjoyed it quite a bit. It had a little more of like the Spider-Man sort of like setting up a big villain and introducing a new kind of rival. I thought Overtkill wound up being a pretty cool villain overall. And again, love seeing those busted up cyborg bits. Todd really excels at drawing that. This really showcases some of his biggest strengths and weaknesses as a writer in a lot of ways. And as a writer artist.
Yeah, I do think that like obviously like mafia stuff is always going to feel a little bit generic. The fact that we don't even get, Vito Gravano slash Tony
Tony
Twist
Twist.
name the first time we see him feels like, hey buddy, you've been doing the Stan Lee like remind us what we're doing every issue kind of thing. And then you're not naming characters, which feels like an oversight if not in the writing portion, then in the editorial portion, because the reveal of the name is not like a big deal.
No, it's not been like built to or teased, or it's not like a Wilson Fisk thing where it's like nobody knows his name or something.
Also, too, we know who a bigger the thing that's weird about all this is, and I understand that it is supposed to be keeping the mystery from us a little bit. Jason Wynn is the villain.
Yeah. And we're meeting
And
all
we
these
never
other
really.
string pullers along the way.
Yeah, I
Malbolgia, Tony
also.
Twist. It feels a little like Todd doesn't quite know how to pace that story out.
The other thing too is this story misses the two of the best characters in all of Spawn to this point, who are Sam and Twitch.
That's true. Sam and Twitch. Thankfully, though, at no point either of those two issues do we get the talking heads, who certainly will be sticking around off and on for some time.
I mean, I want to know. I want to know what the only queer character in Spawn thinks of Overtkill's look.
That's true. I would really like to hear about that. I would also think, actually, though, that might have been one of the more interesting ways to kind of introduce Tony Twist, though, would be to show that he is a known, like, criminal underworld figure, to have some sort of news coverage. Tony Twist escapes prosecution again. Something like that. That seems like a pretty natural place for that kind of.
Yeah, especially because I think that there's like a caption that says like, oh, like what he's going to be doing, and it's like, oh, to pick out a suit for a charity event or whatever. Like, there's something in there that's like, oh, if we just had the talking heads, actually, you could speed through a bunch of this.
Yeah, and it's Todd wanting to cram a lot into two issues, which I don't hate that instinct, to be honest. I think if you're going with like having a really sparse pair of issues, or a pair of issues where you're really trying to move the story along and establish a new part of the world, I don't begrudge it, especially in an early arc, especially right after the first part of the Billy Kincaid story, which is pretty much all vibes and exposition. Like,
Yeah.
wanting to kind of move a little faster than just digging into this one kind of like sort of character piece in a way.
I think one of the things that kind of holds Spawn back to this point, and I think it's why I felt like 5 was closer to the Spawn I had in my head in tone,
Mm-hmm.
is that, yeah, Violator and Malbolgia, and I guess the 5 famous Fleabian brothers.
Fleabiac Brothers. The five
um,
famous Fleabiac Brothers. It sounds like a vaudeville act.
Which that would be hilarious. I would read that issue.
Yeah.
The part of the problem is that Todd hasn't really given us a villain that feels at all urgent, and Spawn doesn't feel particularly urgent in his mission. The mystery of like who killed him is still kind of ongoing. We're gonna get to that, I guess. I guess we get to that after the guest writers. But as we're gonna see with Gaiman specifically, there's like a bunch of different ways to go with what this world is that Todd doesn't really seem that interested in. And
Yeah.
his art feels more comfortable in a two-parter like this than it did with any of the stuff in the first arc, where he's got to draw these like monsters and demons and stuff that, again, I don't think he's wildly interested in that supernatural aspect of Spawn, even though it is crucial to the character,
It's
right?
the
You can't
core of the
separate it.
story. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's the only reason the story, like, that is the narrative. But you're right. He wants to see Spawn. He wants to see that guy doing like Spider-Man stuff in like New
Yeah.
York. No Los Angeles Times in any of the last few arcs either. So we know that. But yeah, he wants to see Spawn doing a lot of that Spider-Man stuff because you can tell he was enjoying drawing that and was like
Yeah.
into that kind of vibe. And I think that in some ways that leads to, like you said, when we get to the Neil Gaiman issue, which I think is coming up next, isn't it?
It's the next one.
Um, we'll talk about how that really begins the expansion of Spawn, even into what it is today. Like a
Yeah.
lot of what the comic and its ilk and its franchise overall is about today, very similarly to many other superhero media, is that it's about there's every version of Spawn you can dream of, and they all love to hang out. We're gonna enter the Spawn verse in probably 500 episodes at some point, but you start to see that in that Gaiman issue, and it does kind of strike an interesting contrast with the arc we just read, where that's almost very grounded. It's about Spawn even ditching his supernatural cape and being like,
Yeah.
actually, that's kind of fruitcake. Guns are what makes me cool.
And I think the writer to sort of push what Gaiman starts even further, and this will be, I think it's like issues 18 and 19, is Grant Morrison. Because when they take on the book, they're like, well, if there's hell, how come we haven't seen more of heaven? We get to see a little bit of that with Angela in 9, but what else is there?
Yeah.
And that's where we get, we're going to get introduced to Redeemer. And I would say that I think Redeemer feels like the first, not, I guess, antagonist for Spawn that feels like, oh, we got stuff going on. There's stuff going on in heaven. What's happening? But I guess these are discussions for a later episode. I like this arc. I think it's fine. I think it's fun. The weird like Stan Lee comic book greats, Rob Liefeld of it all,
Right.
is kind of a fun backstory of like, oh, hey, did you realize that this was created on a random videotape?
Yeah, weird video thing. Yeah, no, I think it's interesting, and I think especially we're seeing more of Todd learning how to do that without the background and the inherent knowledge that comes with people who are picking up a Spider-Man comic.
Yeah.
You know, he's feeling out how to do a story where you introduce a villain in two parts and have a big clash with Spawn and show the villain as a specific counterpoint to Spawn. You know, another person who can take a lot of punishment, that kind of thing.
Yeah, as well as show how capable Spawn is. I think that the focus really of this arc is, and that this is counterpointed by Overtkill's inhumanity, right? The fact that he is basically, by the end, we realize he's mostly robot.
Yeah, he's
There's not
basically
much of
just like a
him.
skull and spinal column left
Yeah.
after all the robot is stripped away. And that does really kind of contrast nicely with the journey of humanity that we're shown with Spawn, where the
Right.
reason Spawn even cares about fighting Overkill and going back to fight him is because of the punishment that's being wrought upon the human element in this story.
Yeah, and that despite his powers and what's going on, he feels responsible, and it makes it, especially, it's actually kind of a nice palate cleanser right after 5, right? 5 is pretty brutal. Not necessarily art, except in a few places, I'd say, but it is uncomfortable and a little unnerving. And I could understand readers at the time being like, what is this? And actually, to that point, I will bring up the letters column for the spawning ground for issue 7 does bring up spawn number 5. Um, Specifically, one person writes in, I've never previously felt the need to write into a comic until reading Spawn number 5, or more accurately, until I became aware of the conservative backlash against it here in Australia. I'm not sure if you've received the
What?
same reaction elsewhere, but out here it warranted primetime press coverage and certain amounts of outrage on behalf of so-called concerned parents. According to this particular program, whose presenter bears an uncanny resemblance in both appearance and views to your comics guest commentator, so I guess the conspiracy guy in the Talking Heads, Spawn number 5 trivialized the concept of mass murder and brutality and was distributing harmful matter to minors. It's a much longer. I'm not going to read the whole thing. It goes on talking about like, oh, what if that got in the hands of impressionable 11 and 12-year-olds, and
Well,
Todd
I think I was
Todd
about
kind of
12 when I read it, maybe. And so, like, I don't know, it didn't make me not hate pedophiles. I don't know.
yeah. Todd writes, in all honesty, David, I was quite proud of issue number 5. This was the first time I wrote a self-contained story in one issue. I get tired of people making comments and telling me how to do my job. The only reason people make such a big deal about this issue is because it's commercial. I could probably do a story with 100 kids getting killed, but as long as it only sold 5,000 copies, nobody would care. So the point becomes, do what you want, just don't do it successfully. Don't fear, I won't buckle under the pressure, because if I did, I wouldn't be standing where I am right now.
I could probably do a comic where I killed 500 kids. 5,000. Incredible.
He's got a point
He does,
though,
though.
which is like, listen, the thing I'm doing is popular, and people are always going to take shots at the thing that's on top. And as long as I'm on top, I'm just going to keep doing what I want. And it's the thing that I think we've said about Todd multiple times already through 4 episodes. He's got the utmost confidence in what he's doing,
Yeah.
and he's really excited to do what he's doing. And while I think that he does take criticism, he's not impervious to it. And that's why there's guest writers coming up for these 4 issues. I think that he just understands he's also understanding the business angle of it, which is like, well, people are falling off by issue 7. I have something that's going to get them back no matter what.
Yeah, he's got these big names coming in. He's always looking at the business side of it along with honestly, he's not creating comics because he doesn't give a shit about comics. He's creating comics because he loves doing it. And I think that's the thing that so much of his enterprise is built around is trying to create an environment where he's just making comics and that's just his job. And he doesn't have to worry about, some editor breathing down his neck or someone telling him what he can and can't put in. I think issue 5 was an important stepping stone, both in terms of his storytelling and also in terms of showing what kind of content Spawn is willing to do. And that's why it's one of the issues that's most well remembered among, longtime readers and fans and even people who are just kind of around in that era. If you know one issue of Spawn, you probably know the Billy Kincaid issue.
Yeah. But similarly, by contrast, it's like this arc acts as a reminder, like we can still do superhero stuff. Like that's where I came from, and I'm still going to get that done. And it is, I think it's a weird arc because, not to get too ahead of the game, but like Overtkill never becomes, he comes back a bunch of times, but I wouldn't consider him that big of a deal in
Right.
Spawn's history.
He's kind of an
Um,
iconic Spawn villain, but not in for the reason that he's like always around. He's not like a Joker. He's just again one of those first toys that came out was an Overtkill,
yeah.
and so he's associated through that. And also, like you said, it really feels like a more condensed take on how to do Spawn's blockbuster arc. Like a lot of it feels very much like the first arc, but just done in 2 issues. So
With some of the table setting kind of already done, so you can, I think Todd's starting to get out of his own way,
a little bit, yeah.
and that's kind of nice. Another thing I'll bring your attention to, because I'm reading the individual issues at this point, is the back of Spawn number 6 has a full ad for Spawn-tastic apparel.
With that panel from, I think that's from that might be from Spawn number 5,
I think
isn't
it's
it?
from 5,
Yeah.
of him jumping off the roof with a really cool cape.
Yeah,
And you
so
had said like, oh, a million ads are just this page. But quality t-shirts and hats are your favorite image characters: Spawn, Pit, the Savage Dragon, Shadowhawk, and Cyberforce. And also there's a big advertisement in here. And if anybody listening had this, like, went to one of these, they keep advertising Spawn Tour 93.
I remember those ads.
Yeah, where the Spawn Mobile and Todd McFarlane would like go to your local comic shop. I need to know if anybody out there got to see the Spawn Mobile.
Boy, I think that might have come to my local comic shop around that time. I didn't go, but they were always hosting events like that. Still a very large comic shop in the area where I grew up.
Cool. Yeah. All right. I think that's been this arc. George, where can people find you if they need to find you?
My name's George Marston. Pronouns are they, them, or she, her. You can find my writing every single goddamn day at newsarama.com, where I work in the comic book mines. And you can also find me rarely and sometimes on social media at Crypt Trash.
Cool. And I'm Pierce, also they, them. And you can find me on Newsarama sometimes. You can find me on Popverse sometimes. You can find me other places sometimes. I'm on the cursed Elon Musk site at PE Lightning. And you can email us at spawnographypod@gmail.com if you have any thoughts about how well we're doing our job or how poorly we are. Certainly Spawn readers were not afraid to tell Todd McFarlane how bad of a job they thought he was doing. So I hope that Spawnography listeners have the same energy and will tell us how much we suck.
And we'll bring that Todd McFarlane energy right back to you.
Yeah. Anyway, this has been another episode of Spawnography. We'll see you next week with issue number 9, written by Neil Gaiman, the introduction of Angela, famous Marvel character. Angela. Have a good one. Bye.
Spawnography!
Hey, hero. It seems I screwed up. Let's try it again.
No, finish it. Come on, keep going.